Hi, I'm Taji. I'm the first opposition speaker. I prefer he or him, and I'll also be doing the reply speech. And for all of us on team opposition, we prefer verbal POIs. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Harith. I'll be delivering the second opposition speech. It's really nice to meet everyone.
Hello everyone, my name is Caleb Low and I'm the third opposition speaker. Thank you.
Cool. Are we waiting on third prop for prop to be here?
Yes, he'll be here in just a minute.
All right, just let us know and then we can start. Just to check, is this an internet connection issue?
No, he's gone to the bathroom.
Oh, okay. Okay, that makes a lot more sense, just in case. Cool.
Hello, I'm back. Sorry for the wait.
Yeah, cool, no problem. In that case, if there are no further issues, let's invite the Prime Minister to open the debate. Here.
Am I visible and audible? I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Innocent lives gone, one after the other, every single day. There's no chance for a proper coalition government that is stable. There's no aid. There's going to be no legitimacy. There is going to be nothing left for Israel. And this is a cycle of violence and horror that is going to continue as long as Naftali Bennett is in power. We have never been prouder to propose. Just a clarification before we get into our positive argumentation. We oppose Naftali Bennett of the Yamina party being in power, and we're going to show you the harms of his governance throughout this debate. But also, as a counterfactual, we support the ascension of Yair Lapid of the centrist Yesh Atid party to govern for the next 4 years until the election. 3 arguments then for a side proposition. Firstly, Bennett's prime ministership will inevitably lead to an unstable political atmosphere for Israel. Second, Bennett's prime ministership hurts Israel's ability to defend itself and sours relations with the USA. Third, and our second speaker will be talking about this, Bennett's prime ministership hurts Israeli legitimacy and leads to hostile international relations. No, thank you. Firstly, Bennett's prime ministership will inevitably lead to an unstable political atmosphere for Israel. We think the problems in Israel are very rampant right now, wherein the biggest problem of their politics means that it's completely unstable. We've had 4 elections in 2 years. There's continuous instability to form a coalition that actually works, that's able to take into consideration the various parties that exist. The centrist parties, the Yesh Atid, the Yamina parties, all of these parties that exist have never been able to come to a proper agreement with who's in governance, and that's never been able to form stability. In Israel, then, for any government to exist, you need a coalition that is strong enough because of the sheer amount of various opinions that exist within one government and one state. The problem with Netanyahu in status quo was that he was unable to form a stable government for 2 reasons. Firstly, he was too right-wing and strongly orthodox. An example of this is that everyone has to serve in the military, except he made it that Orthodox Jewish people don't have to. Throughout his governance, what he managed to do was alienate various parties and various groups. Other parties didn't agree with this, And because it's formed with so many parties, this caused a lot of instability. It caused a lot of weakness. But secondly, he opposed the two-state solution, wherein there's now greater annexation in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, which led to more instability within the region, which led to more violence and more chaos. Understand then that Israelis don't want violence. In their 70 years of existence, they have fought so many wars that the state is just so unstable that it basically lives in a state of constant fear now. We don't think these people want any violence. We don't think they can survive with any more violence. And given that Netanyahu was a rightist, exponentially just multiply all the problems that he had in your head, and there we have Naftali Bennett. We think he makes this just fundamentally much worse because of two reasons. Firstly, he's just far more rightist. We think he has a far greater incentive to then pander to the Orthodox Jew population because he's very explicit in his active support for that part of Israel itself. We think that they're likely to alienate far more parties in the coalition than even Netanyahu did, and that's going to cause a lot more instability in the long run. But secondly, he's far more explicit in being anti the two-state solution. When we think Netanyahu, even though there were a lot of wars being fought and there was a lot of violence, he couched a lot of his anti-two-stateness in a lot of rhetoric, in a lot of gathering support by Israelis. We think what Bennett does then is he's far more explicit in this view of being against the two-state solution. We think this is just going to lead to far more violence and suffering and far more pain in Israel and in Palestine as well. We think what's going to happen if Bennett is in power is that the coalition government is going to be far, far weaker than it was, when the vote of confidence was literally 60 to 59. We think that is such a weak and fragile government operating in such a fragile international situation right now, wherein the attacks with Hamas and the problems that exist there means that literally any soldier interacting with another, any other rocket fire could mean that one opinion might change. This renders the entire government literally useless. We think this is so weak and just provides a further level of instability that exists. That then, what does Israel need from a government right now? We think they need that stability to come, right? A stop to this insanely harmful violence that continues to plague them every single day. We think Israel needs a lot of important legislation as well from parliament, from the Knesset, right? This looks like various things. For example, Netanyahu still remaining in power, even though he was on strong corruption charges. We need to remove laws like that allow sitting presidents to continue to not be prosecuted. Secondly, things like more accountable policing in occupied territories to increase the stability that Israel just does not have right now. All of these things are incredibly important to making Israel a more stable and more strong state in status quo. We think this can only then happen with a proper coalition that aligns the various parties' different interests. That's why we support Yair Lapid in this situation. The reason being, he is far more centrist and less likely to be radical in that sense. He's able to unite various parties in this because he believes in things like the two-state solution that doesn't structurally restrict you to constant violence and constant fighting. We think in the case where you're anti this two-state solution, you can't negotiate, you can't make any structural changes, no thank you, to increase the stability within the region. That's why we think he'd be a far better choice because of his ability to rally around various parties because of his literal position in the center. But the second argument then, Bennett's prime ministership hurts Israel's ability to defend itself and as such sours relations with the USA. We've already told you how anti the two-state solution Bennett is, and we think this is just likely to increase violence between the two states. What happens is we think that with this increase in violence, you're likely to have far more annexation, far more rockets, far more death, far more violence with Hamas. Why is this bad? Two reasons. Firstly, the more conflict that Israel just cannot take anymore because the instability and the chaos is just rising. But secondly, and more importantly for this argument, we think over the past 2 months, the media narrative around Israel has made them demonized as aggressors, as in the wrong, as illegitimate. So much anti-Israel media is coming about throughout the rest of the world. And we think that's going to be a very, very big issue for Israel in the status quo. Why is that? We think they lose out on international aid. And why is this important? Because understand that Israel has a controversial existence in status quo, regardless of all of these questions. They have many enemies in the region itself, regardless of Hamas. There are countries like Lebanon, there are various other terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, like Al-Fatah. We think they need the military aid that comes about from various members of the international community to continue to protect themselves. They need money for military. They need protection from Iraq, from Hamas, from Al-Fatah to continue to develop the Iron Dome to protect their own population. We think the international community being completely appalled at what's going on right now between Israel and Palestine means that there's a lot of animosity from the international community itself. We think this we think what happens then is that they're likely to withdraw aid and they're likely to not continue to support Israel the way they have done before. But secondly, and more importantly, we think Israel's good relationship with the US is of absolute paramount importance, not only in status quo and not only historically, but especially right now. We think with Trump, who is very sympathetic to Israeli sentiments, being no longer in power, we think the reason they can exist so calmly in status quo is because of support from one of the biggest military allies in the world. All of that changes when you switch to a completely rightist anti-two-state person like Bennett. We think when Biden is now when it's now a Biden administration who is part of the Obama government with similar people, with similar policies, and Obama never showed much sympathy to Israel. And we think we can carry that solution over and assume that that's not likely to happen in the Biden administration either. We think it's of utmost importance that they stop the kind of violence that is going on and put someone in power who doesn't fundamentally oppose the values of the United States, so they can continue to exist, so that they can continue to protect themselves from aggression. For all of these reasons, vote side proposition.
Here, we thank the previous speaker for their remarks, and let's invite the leader of opposition to open the opposition case. Here.
Hi, can everyone see and hear me? Thank you. This motion is not "This House prefers Yair Lapid to Naftali Bennett as Israel Prime Minister." Proposition cannot fiat this comparative into existence. They have to prove why it is likely. I'll show, therefore, why all of their harms don't stand. What do we support on opposition? We support the ascension of Bennett to the Israeli premiership. This does not mean giving Bennett carte blanche over the government. We support this power-sharing agreement, where centrist and leftist politicians are also in the cabinet and have powers. They serve as a check and balance, and Bennett has no incentive to disrespect them in order to preserve the coalition, which, as they say, was achieved on the tightest of margins. The comparative on proposition must be allowing Netanyahu to remain as prime minister, as I'll prove later in my case, but he continues to be able to gain control of institutions, the media, and consolidate power to shield himself from consequences. Even if their comparative is a coalition government under him, these are primarily conservative parties, which is the existing state of Israeli politics prior to the rise of Bennett. This means there is little effort in restraining Netanyahu's crimes because conservative parties are ideologically aligned with him. We will prove three arguments. First, on improving Israeli politics. Second, on restraining Israeli governance. And third, on helping Arab Israelis. Before that, let's look at the case of proposition. Proposition's case is premised on the comparative of Yair Lapid ascending to the premiership. They have to prove why this is likely and likely to succeed as a coalition government. This is not going to happen. The reason we know it is not going to happen is because we have tried these options before. 3 times we have tried to form a centrist government under Benny Gantz of the Blue and White Party and has fallen apart every time. What this suggests to you is that a centrist coalition is impossible in Israel, and there are a few structural reasons why. First, as they rightly point out, the Israeli population in general is quite right-wing, given a history of hatred towards the Muslim population in that particular area. Their centrist parties, therefore, don't have much draw. In particular, the leftist parties they want to talk about are particularly castigated, given the historic links to things like the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, which the Israeli people despise. This means that their coalition will not work, and they have to structurally prove why these reasons don't stand, and therefore their magical comparative can come into existence. With that said, let us look at their 2 arguments. First, they said Naftali Bennett is a far-right politician, and this is bad. Yes, we agree. The crucial difference is that Netanyahu is their comparative, and he is also a far-right politician. Their first speaker concedes that Netanyahu is a far-right politician, and merely claims that the difference is in terms of rhetoric, that Netanyahu, for some reason, is more restrained in terms of his rhetoric surrounding Muslims. Okay, how does this rhetorical change actually help people on the ground? Insofar as they can see that these are largely the same, this is not a benefit they can claim. Rather, we agree that Naftali Bennett is a right-wing politician. Our contention is he has no ability to put these right-wing policies into practice. I will show this in my second argument by showing why the coalition restrains him. Furthermore, we would argue that if Naftali Bennett, as proposition rightly points out, if Naftali Bennett does do these far-right policies, his government would fail. And that is precisely why he would not do them. So on the axis of removing far-right policies, we clearly win. We also agree that Israel needs an end to violence, as proposition rightly points out. The problem is that the government is the perpetrator of violence, not the one who attempts to stop it. A weaker government under a coalition led by Bennett does restrain this violence. We'll prove that in our second argument. Their second argument on the international image is entirely hung on everything else in the debate, because it obviously hung on whether their comparative can be a centrist leftist coalition. Insofar as their comparative is Netanyahu, their international image obviously doesn't improve. In fact, we are much better, because the coalition government on our side is actually likely to improve the position of Israel. The reason is because the coalition government is far more representative. It takes into account, for example, Arab Israeli parties, which would never be in government in the world of proposition. If the United States cares about human rights in Israel and the representation of its government, then our coalition government is actually far better in this regard. For that reason, proposition's arguments are out. I'm now going to move on to my first argument on removing the toxic influence of Netanyahu on Israeli politics. Here, I'm going to further prove why the comparative in the world of proposition is one where Netanyahu remained in power. I've already demonstrated why this must be true because all previous attempts to remove him from power have failed. The two previous attempts to pass no confidence motions as well as the two previous elections. Importantly, their candidate, Yair Lapid, is already in the power sharing agreement on our side, which suggests to us that if he was able to form a coalition independently, he would already have done so. The fact that he is sticking with Bennett's coalition suggests to us that he does not have the political power to form this coalition independently. What are the harms, therefore, of Netanyahu remaining in power on their side? It is important because Netanyahu is bad in two ways. First, he's engaging in a dangerous consolidation of power. Netanyahu has been in Israeli politics for nearly 2 decades. And in that time, he has built up the power to severely erode civil liberties and institutions, and I think proposition agrees. This looks like his creeping control over the media, where he was found last year to repeatedly illegally revoke the licenses of media broadcasting institutions to restrain criticism over him and his family. These are further reasons why ousting Netanyahu is extremely difficult in the world of proposition, because he's able to gain further control over these institutions and therefore restrain politics. What this suggests is that Netanyahu must be removed so that this pernicious influence can be removed. This is secondarily important because proposition says, Netanyahu probably has committed crimes like bribery and embezzlement and so on. If he remains in the premiership, it is very difficult to prosecute him for these crimes because he is able to leverage the organs of state power in order to block things like investigative journalism and media reporting. Therefore, securing justice by prosecuting Netanyahu is unique to our side. When we get him out of power, we prevent the consolidation of power because the coalition government does not allow Naftali Bennett to control all state institutions. That is why Netanyahu must be removed. Second, we restrain the excesses of the Israeli government. The premise of this argument is that a coalition government removes far-right politics. I think proposition agrees with the mechanism of this argument because they agree that if Naftali Bennett were to propose, for example, a far-right policy, then his coalition government would likely fall apart. So all I need to do is prove that the incentive of Bennett is more to preserve the integrity of his government than to pass these policies. Obviously, this is true because if his government falls apart, then these far-right policies can't even pass in the first place. So there is no benefit to Bennett actually proposing these policies in the first place if he knows his government is going to fall apart. Rather, we would argue there's significant benefit to him retaining this government on our side of the house, because even if he cannot do these specific far-right policies, he is still the prime minister of the country and his personal political power is maintained. That is why proposition's hyperbole about the instability resulting from this coalition failing does not work. This coalition will not fail because Bennett will not want his government to fail. What, therefore, is the difference between Netanyahu on their side and Bennett on our side? The difference is not one in terms of ideology. As proposition agrees, both of these are far-right politicians. The difference is in terms of their ability to execute these far-right policies. Under Netanyahu, he has led a government of coalitions of conservative right-wing parties. These are unlikely to check and balance on his power, given that they largely agree with his policies. If, therefore, Netanyahu pursues further settlement in the West Bank, for instance, or further disenfranchisement of Arab Israelis, these parties will not stand against him, and these policies will come into law. On our side of the house, Naftali Bennett, as they agree, exercises a loose coalition of parties, including Arab Israeli parties, for example, or leftist political parties. This results in two things. First, it results in a distribution of power. Under the power sharing agreement on our side, important government ministries have been given to other parties other than Bennett's. This looks like, for example, the deputy prime minister position, which was given to an opposition party and not that of Naftali Bennett. This means that these important state institutions are not exercised with far-right policies in mind, but rather much more centrist policies. Second, as I alluded to earlier, it means the ability of the government to actually implement far-right policies is severely reduced. If Bennett proposes further settlement in the West Bank, he knows his government is going to fail and for that reason will not do it. What this means is we restrain the excesses of the Israeli government and prevent the abuses of human rights that are occurring in places like the West Bank and even with Arab Israelis. For all of those reasons, we believe that absolute power corrupts absolutely. We are proud to oppose.
All right, we thank the previous speaker for his remarks, and let's invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the proposition case. Hear.
Yeah, just a second. Am I visible and audible? Israel's existence over the past 70 plus years has not been easy. The fact that the day they proclaimed statehood, the very next day they went to war. 20 years later, they went to war again. And ever since then, they have been stuck in a cycle of violence. However, what is interesting is that despite these 70 years of turmoil, the previous 2 years have been the worst. And the reason they have been the worst is because you had a right-wing leader who could not unite a coalition. His own coalition eroded, leading to 4 elections in 2 years, 4 dissolutions. And we think the replacement of Netanyahu with Naftali Bennett, a significantly more orthodox Jew, someone who is far more right towards the spectrum of politics, and most importantly, someone who is far more anti-two-state solution, will only increase the excesses or the problems that side opposition set out to solve. That is why we do not accept him as the prime minister, and we oppose that. Now, the question before I get into the clashes are 2 very interesting observations of side opposition. Number 1, note that they give you no singular benefit of Naftali Bennett. They spent the vast majority of their time telling you why Benjamin Netanyahu was bad, but they gave you absolutely very little substantive material as to why Naftali Bennett is in and of himself a good leader. The second very important observation I want to make about side opposition is that they claim that we can't support or prefer Yair Lapid in power. This is not true. I will give you 5 reasons as to why our counterfactual is possible and going to work. Number 1, they claim that Benny Gantz, who tried to replace him before, we've already tried centrist politicians. This is a lie. Benny Gantz was a far-right politician and foreign minister during Benjamin Netanyahu's prime ministership. Therefore, you have never ever tried replacing Netanyahu with a centrist politician. So 1, this claim that we've tried this before is actually not true. The second reason why we think Lapid can become prime minister is because we think Yair was a centrist. This is important because the vast majority of the coalition consists of leftist parties, it consists of Arab parties, centrist parties, and a small fraction of it is led by Naftali Bennett, which is extremely far right. Even if you were to lose buy-in from the far right, you would have still gained the rest of the coalition. What that fundamentally means is you would have still had Lapid in power. And the structural reason behind this is because he is a centrist. Centrists have fluid and flexible ideologies. Therefore, they are not bound to the left or to the right. That is why we think this coalition would have happened anyway. The third reason why we think Netanyahu would have been replaced by Lapid is because he would have been ousted anyways. The fact of the matter is he was on corruption charges in the Supreme Court. He would have been ousted anyways, meaning his oustal would have led to Lapid coming into power anyways. And the fourth reason why, and final reason why we think that fundamentally Netanyahu would have been replaced by Lapid is because he lost buy-in from his own conservative Jewish parties. Because the problem with Netanyahu, by virtue of being very pro-Orthodox Jews, was the fact that he literally gave compensation to Orthodox Jewish populations within Israel from not having mandatory conscription. The fact that taxation on them on income tax or property tax is significantly lower. That is why other denominations of Jews did not support it, losing the buy-in, which means they would have supported Lapid anyways. These are 4 structural reasons that prove to you that opposition's entire argument that Netanyahu is someone we have to support are untrue. We don't think that is the case. Notice the ramification on this. Notice the ramification this was in the debate. They have given you not a single line of engagement with our case, and their entire case rests upon the assumption that Netanyahu will be in power on our side. I've shown you why that's not the case. The question then is, where is Israeli politics generally better off? They say Netanyahu must be removed and Naftali Bennett will have essentially a check by the rest of the coalition, essentially why this will be good. Couple of responses. First and foremost, we don't think this is true because the core assumption in their case is that Bennett has a reason to not compromise and will actually engage with the rest of the parties. This is not true because you need to understand the nature of his party. The Yamina party is the most far-right party, far more far-right than the Lapid party led by Netanyahu. What that fundamentally means that ideologically, they are disinclined to not pander to the left or to the centrist parties. What that that fundamentally means is that they're unlikely to compromise. Contrast this with Yair Lapid, who is centrist in nature and more likely to compromise on our side of the house. The second response I have to this is that they claim that, no, this will reduce violence, this will reduce ceasefire. What you're missing out is that Bennett is a politician. Presumably, he will want to run for the Israeli Knesset in the future. Presumably, he may even want to run for prime ministership in the future, given the fact that this is the first time a far-right party has come into power in Israel. What that means is that in order to increase his support, in order to have voters vote for him in the future election, he needs to show that he can ideologically stand his ground. He needs to show to the people that I am unwilling or unhinging from what my beliefs or what my aims are. That fundamentally means that he is unlikely to compromise. What that effectively then means is that he is likely to not reduce ceasefires. He is more likely to increase annexation in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, on the Gaza Strip. That fundamentally means that violence is only going to increase on their side. But even if you were to take opposition at their best and assume that maybe he won't be able to do anything, that's the problem. Nothing is also not an option because Israel needs immediate legislation. They have been failing to get legislation over the past 2 years. We think Bennett's existence prevents legislation from coming because other parties will constantly block him. That is why neither side will compromise. On our side of the house, we think legislation is far more likely. And notice, this legislation is very important. The reason it is important is because Israel has historically suffered from the fact that Netanyahu, despite being on corruption charges, was allowed to remain in prime ministership. You need to remove such laws so such abuse of power does not happen in the future. Therefore, we say that it is important that you have Bennett removed. Also, on this argument that Netanyahu was compromising state institutions, etc., I want to note that their argument that it shows it is a benefit that Netanyahu was replaced is actually symmetrical because he's also replaced on our side by Lapid, which means all of the benefits they want to claim about how, for example, we removed him, how he was trying to amass more power, all of them are symmetrical. With that said, what is my line of argument? Before that, I'll take the PY.
If Yair Lapid have enough support to form a coalition on government on your side, then why has he submitted to the power sharing agreement in the status quo under Naftali Bennett?
Because in status quo, he had to fundamentally agree with Bennett to approach the Israeli government in order for a coalition. We think in the instance that he had not done so, the coalition would have still succeeded in forming. My argument then, we think Bennett's prime ministership reduces Israel's international legitimacy and leads to more hostile international relations. Because we would posit that the biggest problem for Israel as a nation is to constantly justify their existence, is to constantly tell the world that we have a sovereign claim, that we are a nation state, given that Israel is not recognized by a significant chunk of countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, also within the Middle East and all that. Why is this important? Because we would posit that the existence of Bennett, which leads to more annexation within the West Bank and East Jerusalem, is likely to make particularly Middle Eastern countries like Lebanon, like Saudi Arabia, like Gulf states become more hostile towards Israel. Why is this bad? Because we think you need these countries in order to support you because the vast majority of these countries are a national security threat towards Israel. But more importantly, in order for Israel as a country to just accept its legitimacy on the international stage, we don't think that this is good for Israel. Panel, I want to note, opposition's case rests upon the sole assumption that Netanyahu will come into power. For a moment, if you push that aside, they have given you no reason as to why Bennett is a good leader. For all those reasons, I'm proud to propose.
All right, we thank the previous speaker for their remarks, and let's invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the opposition case. Hear, hear.
Hi, can everyone hear me and see me? Thank you. Proposition has agreed that letting Netanyahu remain in power is the biggest problem in this debate, and if that is their comparative, they lose. So if I can prove that this is what happens in their world, then we automatically win because they concede that Netanyahu is terrible. That's it, 2 arguments. 1, why is propositions comparative Netanyahu? 2, even if it is Yair Lapid, why do they still lose this debate? 1, why is propositions comparative Netanyahu? We gave you reasons down the bench that never really heard much engagement. The first thing we told you was that currently, Yair Lapid is already part of a power-sharing agreement. If he could have gotten 4 years in power, surely he would have done so. We asked him this in a point of information just now, and we essentially got a non-response. We must hear a response to this claim in the next speaker. Second reason we gave you, currently, Israel's electorate is incredibly right-wing. This is simply because many of these Jews have often come from Eastern Europe, where they've seen the failure of socialism. They tell us, but many of them like centrists. 1, if this was true, then the centrist party would have won an overwhelming majority. The fact that it didn't highlights that they don't. Second, I suspect this is false at the point where many of them still believe in their religion. At the end of the day, regardless of whether we like it or not, Judaism is a religion that is right-leaning, and many of them still support right-wing parties. So it's not immediately clear that they would support centrism on their side of the house, given that they haven't done so thus far. Third reason we gave you, given that it was a 60-59 vote to support 2 years of Bennett and 2 years of Yair Lapid, if Lapid genuinely wanted 4 years under their side of the house, what would have happened is that Bennett's party would have pulled out of the coalition, because then there's nothing in it for Bennett if he can't remain in power. So it's not even true that Lapid could have formed a 60-59 vote in their side of the house, because Bennett's party would have just pulled out, because Bennett wouldn't even be part of this power sharing agreement. This is a third reason they must engage Rich. No, this third reason takes out, no thank you, the analysis we get in second proposition about how centrists would have still been able to attract small parties in their world, because that is clearly not enough. The fact of the matter is that they still need the Yamina party, Bennett's party. So the fact that they attract small parties obviously isn't enough. So for the same reasons I've given you as to why they can't get Yair Lapid in their world, this is exactly why the comparative is Benjamin Netanyahu. We get a few counter reasons for why Netanyahu isn't going to be in power. The first reason they tell us is that Netanyahu has lost buy-up from Central Orthodox Jews because he's too extreme. One, they contradiction, because they also tell us that Netanyahu was too moderate, which is why Bennett is now more extreme and more radical. So this is clearly a contradiction. But second, you know what would have happened in their world? I suspect in their world, Netanyahu would have retained power precisely because Bennett would have supported him. Think about all of their language. If it's true that Bennett supports far-right policies similar to Netanyahu, what would have happened in their world? I suspect that when Bennett knows that he's not going to have any power in a coalition government with Yair Lapid, when Yair Lapid has 4 years, that is when Bennett's party would very likely have shifted towards supporting Netanyahu, which means Netanyahu's far-right power, the Likud party, would have stayed in power even longer because they would have gotten the Yamina party's votes because their policy stances are quite similar. That's it. Very clearly, no thank you, that on their side of the house, Netanyahu would have remained in power. The last reason we get is that, well, Netanyahu obviously lost because people don't like him. One, yes, this might be true, but the problem is that, as I've already illustrated, the Yamina party shifts to support Netanyahu on their side of the house. Before I go on, I'll take the point.
Benjamin Netanyahu lost his coalition because the various conservative parties you claim lost his life, stopped supporting him. Yair Lapid could have gained their support as well. Why is this not the case?
The reason they stopped supporting him is because they agreed that they wanted Naftali Bennett to get a power-sharing agreement. The fact that Naftali Bennett cannot remain in power means he has no incentive to not support Netanyahu, because Netanyahu supports incredibly similar policy proposals to him. I've already responded to this. We need to hear a response in the next speaker. Why is this important? Because what I've necessarily proven is that in their counterfactual, they support a world when Netanyahu remains in power. We've given you a list of harms of this that they have yet to countenance. Number one, that on their side of the house, Netanyahu has committed crimes and we need to prosecute him. Number two, that Netanyahu supports a vast majority of problems that are incredibly bad. They support things like, for instance, going into the Gaza Strip and invading the West Bank. The only response we get is that, well, doesn't Bennett support this as well? Isn't Bennett also very bad because he supports invading the Gaza Strip? This misses the nuance of our claim, because we argue that in a coalition government, Bennett uniquely can't do these things, because if he points out and he supports incredibly extreme things, so for instance, if he supports things like going to the Gaza Strip, then it's very likely that he would be voted out because people would leave the coalition. So it's not at all true that Bennett can do extreme things. No. This means that all of the analysis of how Bennett is very bad is out of the debate because he's constrained by a coalition. I'm not going to engage on the best case. Let's say I move to my second contention. Why do they still lose even if it's Yair Lapid? Here's why. Precisely because of their case. The entire case contradicts this claim when they tell us that stability is very important. They say we must have a stable government. It's very important that we don't have things like gridlocks in parliament so we can pass policies. I suspect that if they want something more radical than the status quo, where Yair Lapid only has 2 years, if they want a system where he has 4 years, that's even more radical, which means the coalition is going to be even weaker. So all the harms of stability are flipped. If they really believe stability is so bad, things are far more unstable in their world when Yair Lapid has to rely on even more of a coalition. That's the biggest problem. In fact, comparatively, we told you were better because Naftali Bennett was restrained by a coalition, and we told you this was a good thing. The only response we get here is an assertion. They tell us that Bennett is never going to compromise and he must appeal to ideology. If not, he's going to lose his voters. One, this is simply not true because in their counterfactual, if Bennett did something very bad that other parties disagree with, he would automatically lose power as well. So it's not clear why he would do this. Second, I suspect many of his voters are aware of the fact he's in a coalition. They are aware that he can't make incredibly extreme compromises. What have I proven thus far? One, that under our side of the House, Naftali Bennett is better because he's actively restrained by a coalition, meaning he can't do very, very bad things. Second, I've proven that their claim on having Yair Lapid in a coalition contradicts their primary benefits. And lastly, I've proven that their counterfactual is Netanyahu, something they agree is unambiguously far worse. I'm now going to move on to my final argument on protecting Arab interests in Israel. The thesis of this argument is simple. Coalition governments often include, currently status quo, includes an Arab party, which is instrumental to protecting the rights of Arab citizens. Here in this argument, I'm going to engage on their best case and assume the contradiction I mentioned earlier doesn't exist. Let's say it is true that Yair Lapid remains in power without needing a coalition. Here's why I'm going to show you why Yair Lapid in power without needing a coalition is harmful to Arab citizens. The premise of this argument is that Arab people remain oppressed in Israel today. The reason is fairly simple, precisely because of the net policies that Netanyahu has been able to pass over the last 2 decades. His legitimacy, as both sides agree, was based on an ultra-nationalist form of Zionism, which has manifested itself in policies that oppress Arab citizens. For instance, he has stopped the teaching of Arabic in schools and passed legislation to restrict employment for Arab citizens. Why is this important? This is important because it proves that Arab Israeli citizens are the most vulnerable actor in this round. That's it. Why do they not protect Arab citizens in their round? Not in their world. Not only is it because their comparative is Netanyahu, someone who actively dislikes them, it's also because Yair Lapid, in a world where he has no coalition, their best case, has no reason to listen to Arab interests. The reason for this is because a vast majority of Israelis continue opposing Arabs. This is because of the ideologies that Netanyahu has been very able to successfully spread. This is because over time, Netanyahu has told people that Arabs are here infringing on our rights. And Netanyahu can point to the Palestinians and say, look at these Arabs coming to our country, firing missiles at us. This is why a vast majority of the Israeli population often doesn't really like Arabs, which is why they don't want to protect them. Why is this valuable? Because it means that in their comparative, Yair Lapid has no incentive to protect this group of people. Let's say it is true he has no coalition. Then protecting this group of people, protecting the most vulnerable people and passing legislation to help them is very politically unpopular because he does not need the Arab coalition based on their own case. Now, we're not saying that Yair Lapid is going to do things that harms the Arabs, but what we are saying is that he has no incentive to pass policies to overturn the previous legislation that existed that continues to oppress them. This is why the lives of Arab Israelis continue to be terrible in their world. Our counterfactual is better, precisely because in our counterfactual, we have one Arab party in this coalition. If this party chooses to pull out, this means what is likely to happen is that the coalition will dissolve, which is precisely why this party now has leverage to be able to support things, for instance, like rolling back the incredibly harmful policies which we mentioned earlier. What have I proven thus far? First, I've proven that their comparative is Netanyahu and they lose on that already. Second, even if their comparative is Yair Lapid, I've shown why they lose. And lastly, I've shown that the most important actors in this debate, the most vulnerable people who are Arab citizens in Israel, are better protected under our side. Because absolute power corrupts absolutely. I have never been prouder to oppose.
All right, we thank the previous speaker for their remarks, and let's invite the government whip to conclude the substantive portion of the government case. Hear, hear.
Am I visible and audible? Okay, perfect. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The very interesting thing about Team Opposition's case is that it all rests on one very shaky assumption. Let's walk ourselves through it. They agree that Bennett is a much, much more far-right politician. They agree that over the past 12 years, far-right policies have ravaged and tarnished the image and politics and governance of Israel. The only thing that they then disagree on, and the only assertion that they then keep on bringing, is that somehow an even more far-right politician whose entire ideological inclinations and mandate for governance has been based on the oppression and further oppression of Arab Israelis is now somehow going to be held back by a coalition. If we take this claim down, then they have absolutely nothing going for them in this debate, because all the entirety of the rest of their analysis of our policy have been bad, take themselves down and shoot them in the foot. But before I move on to the issues, what was our case? While we do say that Netanyahu was bad and needed to be removed, our case was that Bennett is much, much more worse due to the increase in aggression of those very policies. Us saying that Bennett, that needs to replace them does not take away from the fact that Bennett is a much, much worse politician. But my second speaker gives you four fundamental reasons why, many more fundamental reasons for why Yair Lapid and a government for that is much, much more likely to increase, reasons that we're not engaged with. Further reasons look like this. First of all, that Yair Lapid is going to power in the next 4 years anyway. What that suggests empirically is that they have the political and social capital for governance in Israel within the first place. The second thing that is very important to understand is the current context of Israel and politics and the population within Israel. For the past couple of years, Israelis have been hiding in shelters, and all of them want the fighting to stop. What needs right now is a stop in fighting and not further aggression. And this further and existing context is much, much more different from the context of 12 years ago, when the entire population was much, much more far right. The third reason that was never engaged was the idea of this 59-60 split. The amount of legwork required is not that much substantial. But fourth is the reason where they stab themselves in the foot. When they say that Bennett would have pulled out if Yair Lapid was likely to become the leader, then that stabs themselves in the own foot, because they agree fundamentally then to the fact that a far-right government of Bennett was never going to agree to the centrist policies, let alone a centrist individual or a centrist politician coming to power within the first place. All that we're ensuring with Yair Lapid coming to power is that we can't afford the next 4 years of waiting for that to happen, and that's something that is necessary within the status quo. But even so, our case was built on the premise of how Bennett is much, much more worse by virtue of his policies than Netanyahu was. That being said, a number of questions. Number one, what will governance under Bennett even look like? Number two, the idea of Arab interests. And number three, the idea of international relations that we're absolutely no engagement with. The first question, then, what will governance even look like? Now, a very false empirical claim that we get from them is the idea that Netanyahu would have supported this government. This is empirically false, because if that was true, he would have been added to the current coalition. The fact that he isn't is testament to the fact that that support doesn't exist, and there are very diametric differences that exist between both parties in regard to their much aggression of reports. But let's come to their main claim over here. Their main claim that the coalition is somehow going to hold back the policies of Bennett and somehow ensure that those policies don't come to fruition. I have three refutations to this and three reasons for why that isn't the case. The first question that we ask over here is, what has Bennett's political career entire look like? The entire mandate for him coming into power hasn't been based on the idea of international relations. It hasn't been based on the idea of economy. It has been based on a very sole premise of anti-Arab rhetoric, increasing aggression within the region and increasing the annexation that is taking place within the region, and a very staunch opposition to any form of two-state solution. The fact that he's still in power is testament to the fact that is something that is not willing to compromise on, and policies that are going to come into fruition, because that is the majority and the primary aims of the mandate, as opposed to other issues which would have made sense and would have justified for some means probably. I'll take you later. The second idea is that if this were true that that the entire Israeli government system is inclined towards pulling far-right politicians under a coalition system towards centrist policies, then Netanyahu as a politician would have understood this. Any individual who understands that his centrist policies are something that are much more likely to be accepted within a coalition government would have ran as a centrist, because that gives a government much, much more legitimacy and fluidity to deal with the entire political spectrum and negotiate with them. They stab themselves in the foot with that refutation. But the third idea of ideological inclinations was something that was so true. The fact that that was the primary mandate that these individuals came to power on is testament to the fact that these are the policies that are likely to come into fruition and are not the policies that are up to debate. If the primary mechanism, the primary mandates of something that other politicians wouldn't have allowed to happen or would have pulled them back, then that would never have happened within And because this mandate has allowed him to come to power within this in the first place, that means either one of two things happen in their best case. Number one, either aggression within the region continues to increase, or number two, nothing happens. The government ends up in a standstill. And the problem with that is much, much worse, because what Israel as a region requires at the moment is immediate action, is action being taken, and a large majority of legislation, problematic legislation, being repealed. multiple examples of this. The idea of legislation which doesn't allow presidents to be prosecuted, legislation of accountable policing. If they are agreeing to the fact that a coalition is going to pull back any policies that a far-right candidate is going to go for, then they understand and agreeing to the fact that these policies are something that are likely to never going to be passed. And the question then becomes, and the conclusion therefore then becomes, that Yair Lapid, as a much more fluid candidate, as a much more centrist candidate, would have a greater ability to pass this legislation and ensure that this goes through and the government doesn't end up in a stand. The second issue, the idea of Arab interest. Two reasons why that isn't going to happen. The first reason is that just because the coalition is holding back a far-right politician, if we are to agree to their analysis, that does not by any means a positive inclination or positive policies being passed for Arab Israelis by any regards. They never prove why that is happening. But secondly, we believe that Yair Lapid, for a politician who already agrees on the fact and supports a two-state solution, even if the coalition government doesn't allow him to go through with that, the least that happens are at least any means of positive inclinations towards the government. Before I move on, I'll take that view.
If Naftali Bennett proposes a far-right policy, how will that policy be passed if he loses his majority as a result of it being a 60-59 split?
Because that is not something, because if it was the primary mandate for which he came into power, those are the policies which are likely to go through within the first place. These are not policies that they will be able to go through, but much more things are likely to go to a standstill. We've been analyzing this from first. And the last issue that we got absolutely no engagement on, the idea of international relations. We told you that Israel has a very controversial existence, that aid is something that needs to a maximum degree for legitimacy within the first place. When Israel starts pursuing or elects a much more far-right politician who is much more less susceptible to stopping the violence and stopping the aggression, then number one, it loses its ability of governance, but secondly and most importantly, it loses its biggest international supporter, which has been advocating for legitimacy in the first place. That itself is a harm that I believe wins us debate. But they also didn't agree with refute or deal with our argumentation about how hostility towards the nation to a much more degree increases and reduces their ability for any practical governance to reduce incentives within the region. For all those reasons, word prop.
All right, we thank the previous speaker for their remarks, and let's invite the opposition whip to conclude the substantive portion of the opposition case. Here.
Testing, can everybody hear me? Probably for both sides in an ideal world, we would want Lapid to be in power. But it was an unfair comparative from the beginning to suggest that that would be the case if Bennett did not rise in this coalition government. We attacked them in first and second and asked why this was likely under their side of the house. In the previous speech, we heard a very interesting shift. They shrunk and they dropped their comparative. What we instead heard was 8 minutes of them explaining why Bennett was worse than Netanyahu. We would probably agree. Bennett probably has more extreme stances, but what they failed to recognize in all three speeches is that we can constrain Bennett, where in a parliamentary system, he needs the collaboration of his cabinet, of his coalition partners, of the people who is his defense minister, his deputy prime minister. They have not dealt with this, although we brought to you since first. They have only regurgitated the mechanization, but not shown us why the impacts accrue. A much worse politician does not mean a much worse policy. What then am I going to show you? Firstly, that under our side, we protect people better. Secondly, that we protect politics. No, thank you. Firstly, our side protects people better. On both sides, we agree. We dislike belligerent policies against the Arab Strip, the remilitarization in Gaza, or the one-state policy. The key question is which side achieves this better. And on our side, at least we can constrain the ideological tendencies of Bennett. They have not dealt with this. We told you since first speaker about how at least we control ministerial positions, which prevents Bennett from monopolizing power. We told you how in a cabinet, people have veto powers that ensure they cannot simply pass any legislation that Bennett wants. Therefore, even though Bennett might be ideologically further to the right, at least on our side, he would be more muted in his demands for what he has from his cabinet.
Point of information.
Any policy he wants because he relies on the backbone of a centrist left policy. I have already shown you, and we told you this in our previous two speeches, that actually most of his voters know that he rose as a result of a coalition government, and as a result are very unlikely to demand of him to vote in far-right policies. We actually have seen precedents for this in the past. For instance, when the Conservative Party in the UK collaborated with the Lib Dems, what they saw is that they just did not push for all of the demands that they previously wanted. As a result, they had more control over the far right under our side of the house. What was their side's response? Firstly, they tell us a coalition government will be unstable, and as a result, we cannot have this constraining power. Notice that Bennett actually has a good incentive to want to keep this multi-party platform stable. Insofar as he continues to want power, he will want to do so and ensure that all of his coalition partners are intact. The very fact that this was a 60-59 vote will mean Bennett is beholden to maintain the support even of the smallest Arab parties on our side of the house. This was uniquely the analysis we brought to you in our second speaker argument that they did not deal with. Under our side, because of the desire for stability, which their side talks about, it is this reason that ensures the coalition government will be protected. Even when the term of this guy reaches its end, he's very likely that he has the support of people within his cabinet to ensure that he still has power in the new one. Therefore, this coalition government is very unlikely to be unstable, and thus we are able to keep Bennett in control. Finally, they tell us, gridlock. I would suggest that the strongest policies can still continue to apply under our side of the house, given that the left, center, and the right tend to agree on this. What does this look like? Passing vaccines, the strongest response to COVID-19 in the Middle East, for the very reason that this is something that all voters want and performance legitimacy is important. But I would also note that that has not impacted gridlock. Even if we admit that on some policies there is likely to be greater slowness, they have not dealt with the other outcome of gridlock, which is that at least we prevent Bennett from passing all of the far-right policies, all of the tranches that they talk about that they simply have not chosen to engage with. Therefore, under our side of the house, we have shown you that we actually ensure we constrain Bennett. Crucially, their side's comparative must be Netanyahu, and they concede to this in the previous speaker because they tell you about the fact that they think that this guy is better than Bennett. There are a few reasons why Netanyahu would be no better than Bennett is. First of all, he grew up in the same political climate. In fact, he was brought up by other people like Ariel Sharon, who are oftentimes even more far-right than people like Bennett. He supported settlements in the Gaza Strip. He supported militarization in the Golan Heights. I think that if they want to talk about war for the past 20 years, this is their comparative on their side of the house. Netanyahu is far worse. But rather than just being ideologically worse, Netanyahu is worse because he is not constrained. He has a monopoly of power on their side of the house, at the very point at which Bennett has a political monopoly and will be forced to support Netanyahu, given that he is the prime minister. Therefore, Netanyahu will have lots of power under their side of the house, and they will have no ability to constrain him. Therefore, what have I shown you thus far? The comparative on their side must be Netanyahu. It is not Lapid. As a result, they have more far-right policy, not less. Before I move on, I will take that point.
Your single biggest impact is that Bennett can be constrained by the coalition. Why is it that centrist party who also have an incentive to pass policies, why won't they compromise to Bennett's claims or his aims as well?
Yes, they will probably need to constrain to some extent. But the thing is that they will not compromise and allow for all the policies that they want, given that they still need to maintain the popularity with their base. Crucially, this applies under your comparative. If you have Lapid in power, what you're likely to see is that he has to compromise with all of the right-wing partners in his coalition. The harm is symmetrical, and you should have explained this far earlier in this debate. You have not done so. Therefore, under their side, Lapid's comparative is even worse, given that his coalition will be more unstable, given that he does not have support within this very coalition he seeks to lead. Therefore, under their side, Netanyahu is simply far worse. He has boosted legitimacy and he's able to pass his whole agenda given that his coalition was far tighter. On the very least, we can constrain Bennett rather than on their side where they simply leave the far right to its own aims. But I'm going to move into my second clash, where I'm going to ask which side protects politics far better. Here, their side simply refused to engage with two independent paths to victory that we postulated since first. First of all, we told you how we are able to achieve justice. We can charge Netanyahu for many of the crimes that he talked about since first speaker. We know he has committed bribery. We know he has committed fraud. On their side, they cannot keep him into account because of the fact that he remains prime minister and is able to keep any media attention away from him. On our side, we can bring him to justice. This is important given that both sides believe that confidence in politics is necessary. So even if you think that the clash about Lapid, Netanyahu, as I've proven in my first clash, is simply not important, it is this second clash that they have simply not dealt with since first speaker. On our side, we are able at least to keep him into account. But secondly, and more importantly, they have not dealt with the nuance of our second argument, which is that we prevent backsliding into authoritarianism. On their side, Netanyahu has access to the media. He has access to things like the telecommunications CEO, and as a result is able to push for the things that he wants. Under our side of the house, we simply get rid of him and ensure that anyone else in power is able to prevent that kind of backsliding into authoritarianism. Given that this is the case with Netanyahu, their side's comparative in their third speaker is simply far worse, given that in the future there will be no ability to take Netanyahu out, given that he can develop into a leader like Erdogan has. Therefore, I suspect that on their side, they simply cannot claim the benefits of Netanyahu without dealing with the harms that we told you since first. Finally, international relations. First of all, I suspect this is irrelevant, given that the US has strong incentives to support Israel on both sides. Secondly, that this is hung on them proving that Lapid is their alternative and therefore more palatable to Biden. Finally, that on our side, when we have a stronger coalition government, it creates a better image. This is what we told you in first speaker that they did not respond to. They only regurgitated their argument without dealing with the changes in this debate. We were proud to show you that absolute power corrupts absolutely. We oppose.
All right, we thank the previous speaker for that speech, and let's invite the opposition rebuttal to respond to conclude the debate for the opposition. Also, I dropped for 1 second, but it was right after the speech ended, so it wasn't substantial. It was fine.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Thank you. We agree. Our world is not ideal, and we would probably prefer something better in the ideal case. Proposition says that they have a better world under Yair Lapid. We asked a very simple question from the beginning of this debate. If that better alternative is possible, then why was it not pursued? Why did Yair Lapid not choose to form this independent coalition government? And why did he choose to work in this power sharing agreement? We asked this in second speaker, as well as in a POI to their third speaker, and we got a non-response. What this proves is that their comparative does not exist. What does their world look like as a result? Let's first take them at their best. Let us assume that the world of proposition has a strong coalition under Yair Lapid. What are the harms of this? First, I want you to know that this contradicts their first speaker's analysis. Their first speaker spent a long time explaining why coalition governments were unstable, bad, and perpetrated violence against the Israeli people. If that is true, then that happens under their coalition led by Yair Lapid as well, because since he is not able to secure an outright majority, he would have to govern via coalition as well. But secondly, we showed a clear harm even in this world, which is that Yamina under Naftali Bennett in their world would shift to supporting Netanyahu in the Knesset in their side of the house. When there is no longer a benefit for Naftali Bennett joining with Yair Lapid because he does not retain premiership on their best case, then he will support the far-right policies of Netanyahu on their side of the house, which is further reason why Lapid would not secure a majority in their world. So that is why their best case is out. But we also prove that this best case is just not likely. Rather, the likely comparative in the world of proposition is one where Netanyahu holds on to power. Importantly, in third speaker, they refuse to engage with the reasons why this is likely, merely reiterating the impacts of their best case. So they concede that their comparative is Netanyahu. From the beginning of this debate, proposition has agreed with us that this is the worst possible outcome, because not only is Netanyahu a far-right politician, he is a far-right politician with a strong mandate. His coalition does not constrain him because it's made up of right-wing conservative individuals who share his policies. And when he proposes settling the West Bank or escalating tensions with Hamas, for instance, no one is there to check him. So the comparative on the side of proposition is far-right policies. That loses on all the metrics that they wanted to talk about. Things like international reputation, for instance, are far worse if Netanyahu retains power and no one is there to check on him. What does the world of opposition look like? We restrain the power of Naftali Bennett. We may agree that Naftali Bennett is a more far-right politician. That does not mean he has the ability to pass more far-right policies. And the reason is because of the way that the government works in Israel. If coalition partners do not support the policies he proposes, which they are likely to do, for example, settling the West Bank probably is not something centrists support, then he knows that his coalition government won't work. And therefore, either he refuses to propose his policy because he wants to retain power, or in the very worst case, his coalition government does fall apart. Even in that case, we restrain excesses like the settling of the West Bank or the escalation of tensions. Even if it is true that this Bennett government will fall apart, that is a benefit because it cannot pass extremist policies. Their only response to this came in a POI to my third speaker, but they said, well, presumably centrist parties will concede some things to Naftali Bennett. First of all, this applies to their world as well. Presumably, this also means that Yair Lapid will also concede certain things to the members of his coalition, and therefore far-right policies will also exist on their side of the house. But presumably, either way, if this POI is true, we win. Either it is true that they don't concede, in which case we don't get these far-right policies, or they do concede, in which case they get both far-right policies as well as centrist policies to support people in Israel. Either way, they win, whereas there are no centrist policies under Netanyahu's government in their world. And as a result, the likely comparative in our world is one of moderate policies. We responded to their challenges on gridlock. We first showed why on the most basic things, gridlock will not occur, for example, providing food to citizens or vaccines, for instance. And even if gridlock occurs, this is better than the comparative where Netanyahu is able to act with impunity. For all of those reasons, we believe that absolute power corrupts absolutely. We are proud to oppose.
We thank this previous speaker for their remarks, and let's invite the proposition reply to conclude the debate in its entirety. You're here.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes.
If you look at your sheet panel, you'll note two very interesting things about side opposition. One, their entire case rests upon the sole assumption that Benjamin Netanyahu will remain on power on our side of the house, henceforth all harms stand. Second, that they have given you absolutely no unique reason apart from one, that Naftali Bennett can be constrained and that's why he's good. Note they've given you no substantive material as to why Bennett is actually good as a leader. If anything, they've actually conceded to our incentives that he's far right, he is probably worse than Netanyahu, which means that they conceded that. But note that we gave you three structural reasons as to why Lapid was likely to come into power. One, he could have gained the parties that Benjamin Netanyahu lost, because through our first speaker analysis, we pointed out how various Jewish parties from various Jewish denominations did not support his ultra-Orthodox support towards certain Jewish groups. That is precisely why they were lost. Lapid could have gained them at the point at which he pandered to them, because by virtue of being a centrist politician, he is not bound by rightist or leftist ideology. No response. The second thing that we claimed was that other Arab parties would have joined Lapid as well, because the alternative would have been Bennett or someone worse. In that instance, he could have gained those parties as well. Note why this is important. At worst, he would have lost the Yamina party, but he would have still gained a substantial amount of support in order to make a coalition. No response from their side. The third thing that we claimed was that Netanyahu would have been ousted anyways because he was on corruption charges in the Israeli Supreme Court. They would have removed him anyways. Three structural reasons panel as to why we think Lapid could have come into power. Notice the ramification this has on the debate, because all their analysis that Netanyahu is bad, he's authoritarian, etc., all of those benefits can also be co-opted under our side because we prove Lapid comes into power. But the second thing, and we were charitable enough, we said, fine, let's say Lapid does not come into power. Netanyahu is in power. We said that Bennett is worse. One, because he has incentives to do things. He has incentives to annex the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip much more than Netanyahu. They concede to this down the bench. The question then is, what are the two outcomes? One, either he passes policy. Why is this likely to happen? Because we tell you that it's a coalition. If your argument is coalitions keep checks on one another, then note why this is important. Then the other parties are likely to concede to Bennett, given that he is the prime minister, given they don't want the country to become unstable. At that point in time, the most vulnerable actor, Arab Israelis, are hurt on their side because annexation increases far more than Netanyahu, even in our worst case scenario. The second outcome is nothing. Is a deadlock, is absolutely no bills are passed. Why is that bad? Because we told you the urgency with which Israel must pass legislation. They gave you no response. And note, even in our worst case scenario where you have Netanyahu, we've already shown to you why he was going to be ousted, that would have been still better, because at least under him, you would have been able to successfully pass legislation. So that effectively means that one, their entire case rests upon the assumption that Netanyahu would have been in power. We've given you reasons as to why that's not true. And secondly, we've given you reasons as to why Bennett is bad. Then why was Lapid good? They said, no, his coalition would have been horrible. One, we already showed to you that his coalition would have been strong enough, given the fact that it would consider Arab and other center or center-right parties, which means his coalition would have been strong in and of itself. And secondly, and more importantly, we said that he was likely to compromise for more legislation because he is centrist in nature. And finally, he supports the two-state solution, which means the most vulnerable actor, Arab Israelis, would not have been hurt by Yair Lapid to the same extent. The reason Team Singapore deserves to lose this debate is for the sole fact that they tried arguing this debate on a very shaky premise. They did not engage with why Lapid in power would have been good, but most importantly, they did not disprove the reasons as to why this coalition could have come about. For the simple fact they hurt Israel, they hurt Arab Israelis, I'm very proud to propose.
All right, we thank both teams for the wonderful debate. We will be back shortly. Can all semifinals